Building on our discussion of energy markets, we will now gain a national perspective. We are joined by Yang Berhormat Nik Nazmi Nik Ahmad, Member of Parliament for Setiawangsa and Malaysia, former Minister of National Resources and Environmental Sustainability. As a key policymaker, YB Nik Nazmi has been a vocal advocate for climate justice and high national ambition, and is the author of several books, including Saving the Planet, Climate and Environmental Lesson from Malaysia and Beyond. We are also pleased to welcome back Dr. Gary Theseira, the chair of the CGM Council, to moderate this session with YB Nik. Let us welcome YB Nik Nazmi and Dr. Gary.
Thank you so very much again, Jia Tian. YB, it's such a pleasure to have you both on our international advisory panel, as you are no longer a minister. Nevertheless, you remain in the parliament, and you've been actually, I think, active with respect to all of the measures that have been proposed in Parliament, particularly as we look forward to the next budget. But welcome, always a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Dr. Gary.
Okay, let's perhaps look at what we've known for a little while that's on the horizon, and how perhaps these things might have implications for Malaysia's nationally determined contribution. Our NDC has from the very outset been one that has been paced, because it's an intensity measure, and the idea really was that if we could focus on how we were able to decouple the economy from emissions, then that would be something that would lead gradually to decreasing the emissions intensity of the GDP, and then finally achieving a level of GDP that would allow us to peak our emissions and then thereafter reduce our emissions. As we look forward, to the release of the climate change bill, which might incidentally be tied to the 2026 budget and some of the budget items there. What do you see as possible implications for Malaysia's NDC? What are the growth areas that we might expect? And then also, what are some of the areas in which we plan to have a sort of a structured exit or sort of de-investment or other kind of perhaps a disincentive moving forward? YB?
Thank you. We are planning to bring our climate change bill to Parliament. I think if all goes well, it should be in this parliamentary sitting, the next one, which will be also the budget sitting. And there's also the NDC, the latest NDC that we have to our NDC 2.0, the 3.0 that we have to submit. The discussions that we had during my time in the ministry was that obviously one is how do we have to maintain at least the base of our current ambition, but also to add possibly an additional conditionality into our NDC targets, right? Because previously, in the first NDC, there was conditionality, then it became absolute. So now we are looking at, maintaining the higher absolute number in the previous NDC, but adding on top the conditionality element. So those things are being looked at. And I know that, there's a lot of debate about the intensity element, rather than looking at absolute element. But I think for Malaysia's perspective is that looking at the just transition, we had to have that wriggle room as we grow. But I do believe that, we also have to slowly raise our ambition. The reality is, there'll be a long debate, and I'm still an advocate of climate justice. But the reality is we will be a high income country most likely by the end of the decade. So I think accordingly, our ambition and all that must also be increased. So we want to grow. I don't think, economic growth, I think, is very important, but it has to be done in a more sustainable and cleaner manner as we become a wealthier economy.
Yeah, I don't mean to push you to disclose things that you may not be able to disclose with respect to the climate change bill. But just stepping back a little bit and thinking of once again the principles of the convention, particularly for developing countries, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, equity, polluter pays principle, all these principles, we see that actually they've been codified, as it were, in the NDCs in some way, and this idea of conditionality is actually indeed linked to the commitments of developed countries or Annex 1 countries. And in fact, there is actually an if-then proposition there, that the extent to which developing countries will be able to reduce emissions depends on the extent to which developed countries fulfill their obligations to provide finance, technology, and capacity support. And then that this has been the reason for the conditional nature, the rationale for putting conditionality on them. And it's just very gratifying to hear you say that this is coming back in. Perhaps thinking about this from further incentive based, how do you see us moving forward in this transition from being sort of a country where these emissions reductions are voluntary to being under some legislation of some kind, where for the first time Malaysia will actually perhaps be moving into an area where emissions reductions are not on a voluntary basis, but actually on a compliance basis, which means that businesses in Malaysia, depending on their sector, depending on the intensity of their emissions, will fall or might fall into categories that either have emissions caps or have some other kinds of emissions limitations for the first time. Do you believe it will be something that the market will manage in terms of emissions trading, or do you see it coming in the form of something that will be passed directly to the government in the form of a tax that the government will then sort of reinvest in different parts of the economy that it sees fit? YB?
So, well, I believe the idea, at least, the version that when I brought to cabinet the climate change bill, the idea is, there will be provisions for both carbon tax and also ETS. And I think that there is a lot of, we're trying to understand still, what's the best way, and how the mechanism will work in detail. But I think the fact that the Prime Minister in the 2025 budget mentioned that next year there will be a carbon tax. I think that's positive, and as much as I think, not being uh, not having a super extensive carbon tax is fine. I mean, as long as we are able to at least cover some sectors, understand how it works. And I think, to be realistic, I mean, you look at the Singapore model, as well as learning from maybe the challenges we faced with GST in the past. It is fine to introduce it at a lower rate in the beginning, and later on. But the important thing is to have the provision for it, so that we are able to deal. So that's with regards to tax, right? But I think ETS is also an important element. And the for us, we so it's part of our ambitions, and while we do have elements of adaptation under the climate change bill, it's a lot of it is focused on mitigation, right? But I think the next part, where next year, if all goes well, we will complete our national adaptation plan. That is the other important part, right? Because I mean, all this net zero aspect and all that is is all fine and good, but I think adaptation is something that we do not look into enough, because climate change is already here. And even if we are able to limit it, 1.5 degrees in stuff now, and you're looking at 2 degrees, even if we are able to keep it within that, there will be, sea level rise, global heating, and all this thing that is that we're facing today, right? So we need to adapt to that, and I think that that is another aspect that more focus needs to be on.
Yeah, very, very gratifying to hear you talk about sending this all-important signal, whether it is via a carbon tax, regardless of the rate or regardless of the threshold of entry for corporations. I agree with you completely that it sends a signal both domestically as well as internationally. Also the adaptation. I'm not sure if you were able to catch the welcome remarks earlier, but the idea really is that, even though we are in an El Nino neutral situation and have been since after 2023, nevertheless, we've still seen a large number of heat waves in the area, and just north and south of the equator, in some cases even close to the equator. And now we are seeing research coming out that talks about heat waves being driven not so much anymore by a lack of rainfall or lack of water, but actually being driven by temperatures so high that even with your regular rainfall, you might be driving ecosystems to evaporate water and also evapotranspire as plants do water. In terms of the adaptation plan and the linkage to our ecosystem health, as well as to some degree our food supply and food security. Are there areas perhaps in the incoming budget or perhaps in the National Adaptation Plan that might be tailored to address some of these issues? Could you expound a little bit on that? Thanks.
Well, I'm not too sure about the budget per se, but I know that, this the aspect of National Adaptation Plan and the 13 Malaysia Plan, that was partly influenced by that. But I think, because the reality is, and here, I realized that I could see the greater realization and awareness at the cabinet level, because and at one point in the first year of when I was a minister, it was NRECC, and we were in charge of electricity, water, and flood mitigation. So there is a greater realization about the massive costs of all our flood mitigation projects, and what can we do better, because and all this flood mitigation, the gray projects, the hard infrastructure, it's expensive and it takes many, many years for it to complete, right? And we are always playing catch up. You're looking at the average recurrence interval, the ARI. In the past, we used to have 50 ARI, and that was sufficient, right? But now we are talking about 200 and beyond. So that is why we need to look at other aspects as well about, how do we um, approach in our designing of cities, designing of infrastructure in a way that we can accommodate the changing climate patterns, and in a way that is perhaps, if you build it in, then it is less costly for the government. And you don't have to have a long lead time to wait for the infrastructure to complete. So I think that is an important consideration, of how we deal with climate change, because otherwise, we get a lot of we are spending so much money, right? And the other thing is also to ensure that that the information and the risk it's properly understood. And I think, one of the things that we should, I mean, it was agreed in cabinet, but I've not seen it out yet. And I know some developers are not too happy, is about the flood risk, the flood hazard maps, because this will give a better picture about the flood risk in every area, It's quite common in some countries to have this, but in Malaysia we have not published it yet. Although in principle, I think the cabinet has agreed. So I think this is some things because otherwise this cost is socialized on the government. You look at the Sri Muda floods and all that when it was not, we're not supposed to build houses there. And today government has to compensate, right? If it's properly transparent and then it will be, the risk will be understood, then it will all be priced in with regards to insurance, right? And I think that's one way where, because but the government cannot step in every time when we have, and this will become more and more common in the future, flash floods and all this.
Yeah, very clearly, YB. Thank you so much for that clarification, and particularly on trying to build ahead of the return interval of these floods. It seems almost like a losing battle when you think that a flood should reoccur on the average in the long term every 50 years, and all of a sudden it's coming every 5 years. So, of course, the implications are huge, and if we are investing a huge amount in our national budgets for this kind of flood mitigation, it seems like it's a losing battle. In your view, what do you think of the idea of really moving from these hard structures to more perhaps nuanced approaches using nature-based solutions? In your words, perhaps we've built where we shouldn't build. Should we be actually thinking of rather than trying to defend these areas, actually allow the water to move where gravity wants to take it and needs to take it if it needs to either move to the sea or to be stored, and actually begin some programs, perhaps a pilot in nature of reacquiring some, or working with the private sector to reacquire some of these areas that are very high risk, and that in terms of land use would be best appropriated to water storage or water easements, or even multi-purpose use, such as combining recreation and leisure space with water bodies and drainage areas. In terms of, so is there room for that perhaps in the adaptation plan?
There should be, and I think there's been, we had this worrying developments that I think if you've been following the news, for example, in KL, we had some flood retention ponds or the buffer areas that were previously, required to be kept as it is, or like you said, I mean, we can do parks and all that, but certainly not build hard, not build condos and all that. But unfortunately, there was, because I mean, again, without a proper flood hazard map, we saw these lands being developed, being sold and being developed, right? So I think um, we really, because now we have better understanding, we had the whole idea of the sponge city, that has come about. In fact, I mean, even though it came before, even Putrajaya incorporated some principles of the sponge city, i.e., previously the idea was to have a lot of concrete and to put water out to the rivers and get it flowing straight to the sea as fast as possible, all these hard drains and whatnot, concrete drains and whatnot. But I think now we understand that we want to slow it down. We want to keep our rivers, rather than turning it into monsoon drains, keeping it as curving rivers to slow the water flow, keeping the permeable surfaces, in our developments. So now that our understanding has changed, I think these are things that we need to work on, right? So, but realistically, I mean, like going back to your question, should we acquire back this problematic areas, these risky areas? I think the first principle is not to sell them first, because that has happened even recently. To acquire, it's not going to be cheap, and we know the limitations that the government has in terms of fiscal space. So I think that these are the important planning principles, and that I think people expect, that not just at the federal level, at the state and at the local government level, that we need to incorporate in these times, so that we can avoid the mistakes of the past.
Yeah, very, very happy to hear you say that. And recently, of course, in the news, you've also opined about the Urban Renewal Act, which I think is sort of a golden opportunity to review some of these areas where we've previously built and previously developed, and to sort of rethink how we might be able to address that. Seeing as we've agreed to, as it were, revisit that act a little bit. Do you see Parliament or the Cabinet looking at this with slightly different eyes, and trying to see how this can be, on the one hand, accomplished to create the kinds of spaces that are low emissions, that are more resilient to climate impacts, perhaps with greater green spaces and cooler types of infrastructure. And then on the other hand, also, allow nature to take its course. And I think in the long run, have something perhaps even more attractive and viable than just, sort of decorating a river,
Yeah.
riverbanks and the like. What do you think?
Yeah, I believe that I think that most people accept the need for urban renewal. I mean, I know in my constituency there are areas where the homes and whatnot are not fit for purpose anymore. I mean, we're not talking about squatter areas. We're talking about homes that are owned by people, and you need to find ways. And obviously, I mean, developers play a big role, because we need the investments on how to redesign these areas. The problem is that I think, as what has happened, like even in the form of our the flood catchment areas and whatnot, is that a lot of how we do things tend to be very developers centric. It's biased towards developers, right? So I think that is the concern of the form of the URA that we have right now. And again, the other part is also the issue of society or the local community. So we tend to forget in KL, a lot of people rent. But our tenants in Malaysia do not have, we do not have whatever, the tenancy agreements, whatever you can do under the Contract Act, you can do, so there's no protection. The presumption is that landlords and tenants have equal bargaining power, which is not the case. In many countries, we have some form of legal protection for tenants. So I think that's where the government has been talking about residential tenancy act, and I think that has to come first, right? And the URA also, there are details that we need to work on. Then only, I believe that the URA will be fit for purpose, and you do not get backlash, to move people out from homes and whatnot. There needs to be that sense of fairness in order to get the buy-in from the local community. As much as people say, okay, this is flood prone and whatnot, but if they don't see that their investments, their rights are protected, then you won't get the support. And I think that's the other part, because people in this seminar, we are very much believers in building a climate resilient country. But if we do not make the proper case for it, then you will get some politician that will, write on that sentiments, and there will be a backlash. And then we've seen that in the West, for example. So I think that's something that we have to tread carefully, and that's why for me, the URA case in point is something that we really need to do it properly in order to win people over. I'm not talking about 100%. No one will agree. But I'm talking about, getting more people behind and to address their legitimate concerns.
Yeah, thank you. That seems like an all-rounded and a very nuanced and common sense approach to try to deal with this issue. Of course, if I owned property in that area, I'd be very, very concerned about anyone's ability to simply direct its redevelopment, and all of a sudden my life is turned upside down. Very clearly, these things are areas where we have to tread very carefully. But in changing gears a little bit, and moving from Malaysia perhaps out to the international level, we see that the International Court of Justice earlier this year issued an advisory opinion And in that opinion, on the one hand, it looked like they, basically reinstated a lot of the original principles governing the global climate change institutions. I already mentioned those principles earlier, polluter pays, common beneficiary responsibilities, equity, the principle of precautionary, all these things. But at the same time, they said that states did have obligations to take action to reduce the impact of climate change, including both adaptation measures as well as mitigation measures. Of course, Malaysia as a developing country, and a non-Annex 1 country, we understandably could raise the issue of equity in terms of our social development and technological development per se. But the outcome is one of the outcomes of that advisory opinion is that for countries that do produce and export fossil fuels, that there is a responsibility surrounding that might be interpreted as an intentionally or an internationally wrongful act in terms of the impact on global populations. Do you see this? How do you interpret this ruling? Is it more of a plus for developing countries, or does it really shine the spotlight on areas that really necessitate action, closer look, review, perhaps, and even some changes in the focus of our plans for our development, particularly if we look at the LT-LEDs, the long-term low emissions development strategy. And perhaps if I were to tack on to that, some of the latest developments, including the RON 95 pricing, how should we couch that in terms of trying to rationalize or to explain how Malaysia needs sustainable development on the one hand, and yet requires some measure of reliance on fossil fuels to ensure that we have the financing to invest in the cleaner tech of the future. YB?
Yeah, Malaysia is a country that is very much dependent on oil and gas, and I think one of the credits to our country is that we have generally handled this, this lottery that we got just by the accident of geography very well, because we've had countries around the world and they did not manage this bounty in the best way possible. So that's one, right? And I mean, the fact remains that while it has been exploited for probably a century or so in the country, but it's only in the 70s that Malaysia had our own control over this resources. So that's one part, right? And so, but I think the principle or the first principle is that, recognizing that fossil fuel is an issue, because for so long I think the world was trying to avoid that recognition. It was only in COP28 in Dubai that fossil fuels as a whole were included as the need to transition away from fossil fuels became an important part of COP28. In Glasgow the focus was just on coal, right? But in Dubai we managed to go to that level, which is positive. So the decision at the International Court of Justice, I think, is in line with that principle, so that we can recognize the issue. In practical terms, how do we then transition? I mean, that is something that is obviously, I mean, that needs more discussion. Obviously, our climate change bill and all that will start that process partly. And I mean, to the credit of this government, I mean, what I would say we have done well is in not, is the fact that we've started on this shift from blanket subsidies to targeted subsidies. We started with electricity. I was involved with that. We then went to diesel. Water tariffs have also been increased. That was not a subsidy directly, but we've also increased water tariffs, which has been quite cheap. and we have but now is the biggest challenge of it all. This is something that can, if you do not handle it well, it can bring down governments. Even in UK, while they do not subsidize their petrol, the fuel duties remain quite low. I mean, it has been capped for many many years because of the fear of the motorists. So I think, and in Malaysia as well, where we've designed a country that we wanted in the past, we designed it as a mini USA, right? The way we design our highways and rest areas, and even having a national car. So we need to be able to communicate this very, very well, right? And I think that, honestly, if you tell me, I mean, if from a pure political perspective, trying to sell this fuel reforms that we are doing on the basis of climate change is not going to get us very far. That's a reality, right? People will not be really sympathetic. I mean, I think a bigger case would probably be talking about, I mean, the basic argument is how if you drive, a luxury car, you are getting more fuel subsidies than the one on a motorbike. I mean, that is something easier to sell. Um, so to me, we have to communicate it very well. And I understand the government's nervousness. I personally want the because this is the only window that you have, because such is politics. When elections are near and all that, you're not supposed to do this. So I would have preferred that we went further with regards to petrol RON 95 reforms, but we've started somewhere, and I think that is still positive, right? And I think the most important thing is that we have to handle it well. And now the fact that we've started to remove that, and with all the quotas and everything, it's a good starting point for us in the future, maybe 3-4 years down the road, to go even further, right? Maybe if you're earning above a certain income, then you can't get any subsidy anymore and all that. But it is a process, right? So my thing is that the most important thing is we need to recognize that fossil fuel is a problem, but the way we handle the transition must also be done very well. Because it's not only that we've managed oil and gas very well, we've built an entire industry. When people say Malaysians don't like to work dirty, difficult, dangerous jobs, but we have done very well when it comes to oil and gas. So handling this transition is going to be very, very key, right? Again, this has to be handled very well so that we will not create a backlash.
Yeah.
And we do not want someone can win elections in Malaysia by saying that they want to withdraw from the Paris agreement. It has happened in some other countries, so we do not want that to happen to Malaysia. And so that the communications and the application of this transition has to be handled as best as we can.
I couldn't agree with you more, YB, and I think when we think of how this entire policy has been constructed, where the cap is at 300 ringgit, and the methodologies associated with how it's going to be implemented to eliminate or try to reduce the possibility of fraud and abuse. I think all these things do play a role. Maybe you're undercrediting yourself for the amount of background work and foundational work that you did as a minister prior to you leaving the ministry. I think all of these things have sort of been taken on board by the administration moving forward. Are they moving at a quick enough pace though? When we see that, you mentioned that you started off with NREC, where you actually had combined ministries, and then we have this fracturing, and then most recently we've lost your good services from the cabinet itself. But there's a question here from Rosalila Rahman, who asks, how effective are the different ministries in Malaysia working together? And we see that this thing is so trans-ministerial, trans-sectoral, to ensure that the whole ecosystem is managed properly to have an effective climate mitigating risks outcome. So this question from Rosalila Rahman. Would you be able to answer that, YB?
Yeah, there's always the challenge of governments where, if you do not coordinate, then the danger of being in silos, then, it will make things very difficult to achieve all these difficult decisions. Um, there, for example, but how the government works, is not only okay. There's the cabinet. That's one thing, right? So we will always bring our papers to like the climate change bill and all that to be discussed. But we also have these cabinet committees, right? So for climate change, there's a climate action council where the prime minister himself is the chair. It normally sits once a year, and the minister in charge of climate change or the environment will be the secretariat of this council, and all the relevant ministers, whether it's MITI, Ministry of Economy, Minister of Finance, commodities, so on and so forth. They will all be members, along with all the Menteri Besar, premiers, and chief ministers. So the idea is that you will have that that approach that is cross sectoral. And that was how, for example, we had that understanding on the climate change bill. And obviously, some states were not, they had their reservations. And obviously, like Sabah and Sarawak, they have bigger, what do you call that, roles. They have a special position, and they have their concerns. Sabah, for example, they said they do not want this to be a constraint because there's still a lot of poverty in the states and whatnot. So there is that process, right? So I think the important part is that you have key minister. Obviously, the prime minister matters, and then some key ministers that are able to understand this. Then you can have that cross ministerial approach, because sometimes you have people that are not happy to work with other ministries. So I think we have that mechanism, but in reality, I mean, I accept that depends on the secretariat, the minister that is driving it. How effective are these cross cabinet committees, right? But for the other thing that we did, and I think we did a lot of engagement with CGM on this, is we had a climate change advisory and consultative panel where we involve corporates, we involve civil society, including a youth cluster. So that is what we did in order to get as much buy-in, including the climate change bill. We had a series of engagements using these platforms. And I think that is very, very crucial, because I always, there is always people are not so scared of businesses, but people are very scared. I mean, like some of my officers were very scared of NGOs. But I tell them that it's important to have this broad ownership. It's not about having everyone agree, because that's not going to happen. But if there's a detailed process of engagement, people have that buy-in, then there will be a sense of ownership in the legislation. And I think that is what is important, because we want this legislation, including the climate change bill. The idea is that, I was involved a bit in the preparation, but when it's passed, hopefully, then that we will not see it being scrapped in the future. Political change is a reality in Malaysia, but my hope is that is a consensus. And I mean, I think a good example is the UK, where for so long, there was this acceptance, but it did come under threat a bit towards the end of the conservative government. So it is very crucial, because we need to have that buy-in.
Yeah, I do sympathize with your officers, having been in those shoes before, as it were, and working in the ministry. Um, since you've mentioned Sabah and Sarawak, we did speak a little bit earlier about food security, food production, and maybe the link to water. And we did talk about water management a little bit, but more from a floods perspective, not so much from a water supply perspective, given climate change, possibilities for droughts. And of course, forests are almost Malaysia's main backstop for climate change. I mean, sequestering 2/3 basically of our gross greenhouse gas emissions. and perhaps during your term that these ecological fiscal transfers, or the EFT, were initiated as an important signal to states that having land under their purview, under the jurisdiction, that they take a more active role in managing and maintaining forests and their forest health, in terms of their importance, not just for sequestration, but also in terms of biodiversity, maintenance, in terms of water management as a watershed, maintaining water quality and water supply, and all of these issues. Is this something that you see moving forward in future budgets and future plans? Is it something that we can bolster to sort of reaffirm the role of forest and natural areas?
Yeah, EFT was initiated 2019 at 60 million ringgit per year to be distributed to the states. And then it went up to 70. And then when we came in 2023, it became 150, then 200. And this year it's 250 million ringgit. So on that point, on that score, you don't see many initiatives by the government where you see that you get that sort of increase, right? But if in my conversations with the Menteri Besars and whatnot, that amount, they still argue that it's not enough. And I mean, it's because it's not a compensation, it's more of an incentive, right? Because government can't afford to compensate it yet. So, and we've done other things as well because previously, I mean, I know it can be controversial, but I understand the point where because that money was only to be spent in certain designated areas, i.e.,
Yes.
to add more protection areas. We've added actually 300,000 hectares as a result, protected areas as a result of EFT, and 90,000 on land and probably 30,000 forests per se. So, permanent forest. So, but and you can do ecotourism and all this stuff. But so that's rather limiting in a sense for some state governments where paying salary to their civil servants also is something of a headache for them. So what we've allowed is that of the 250 million, 50 million can be tapped to be transferred directly to the consolidated account at the state level. So my hope is that governments that may not see so much the ecological point of doing this will at the very least have that, because they are seeing more money for their budget, right? So I think this is a way to get them on board. But obviously, we have to monitor things closely to make sure it's meaningful, that states are, properly audited for all that they do. And there's also a higher, previously it was mostly with regards to the assessment of how much you get is based on what area you have. So on that score, it will always be Sabah, Sarawak, Kelantan, Pahang, that is in the lead, or Perak perhaps. But we put on equal consideration, size, but also in terms, so it's based on quantity, but also quality. So have you actually, because for example, one consideration is the National Forestry Act that was amended in 2022.
Yeah.
We put the provision of public hearings for degazettement and also equal size minimum, any degazettement must be compensated with at least the equal size of protected forest. So you only have, that's based on the Selangor model. Perlis has adopted it. Not sure whether Negeri Sembilan has, but other states on the peninsula, they have not entirely accepted it, right?
Mm.
So that becomes one of our consideration. If you put that in your legislation, then we are able to give you more points that will translate to more money under the EFT. Because the reality is, right,
Reality.
as much as we can agree in these national meetings on land and all that on these principles, but forest, land, these are all state matters. State has absolute sovereignty to decide how they go about it. I mean, there's some coordination at the federal level, but that's the key word, coordination. So without we have to work around. I mean, I think to amend that, in reality you won't get that. So we have to find a way to work within our constitutional structure.
Yeah, there were, at least in my time, which is quite a while ago now, betraying my age, but there was the Mesyuarat Menteri Besar. At some point, is that something that's still going on, particularly with respect to now, maybe trying to move climate issues to being a permanent agenda item, especially since Sabah and Sarawak already have their acts. Is this something that is still being used as a platform for engagement?
Yeah, we have the Mesyuarat Menteri Besar and Ketua Menteri,
Ketua Menteri, yes. Yeah.
which is chaired by PM.
Mm.
So that's for general high level coordination. So sometimes when there's an issue relating to forest or land or whatever, then I will be invited to join that meeting. And then there is also, and I think that happens probably twice a year at least. Then you also have Majlis Tanah Negara. So
MTN,
that's
yeah.
with regards to land, which is another state matter. So you have the same, PM and so that NRES is the secretariat, and then you have the various heads of the state governments. Then the other part that I mentioned earlier is that since I can't remember, probably about 10 years or so, we've introduced the Climate Action Council. So that is
Okay.
more on climate change stuff. So like climate change bill, carbon tax, carbon market, all those stuff we brought through the Climate Action Council. So again, we have relevant ministries, but also the state governments. So that these are the various platforms. So there's actually quite a few. So depend on, so like forest will normally be under Majlis Tanah or under Mesyuarat MB Ketua Menteri for us to coordinate with the state governments.
Once again, a slight change of gears, perhaps, but we heard Ian um, earlier, as well as Dr. Izadi, talk to the issue of investments associated with data centers and AI. For us being a growth area for these industries, perhaps we do have a question here from an anonymous attendee. It reads, how can Malaysia address climate biodiversity risks arising from AI-driven energy demand, and also the potential for nuclear? Is there any potential for nuclear energy development? And once again, these were mentioned earlier by both Dr. Izadi as well as Ian, but perhaps if you could give us a local flavor for these issues. Notably, I think I think there's a lot of concern about data centers and not that just the consumption of electricity, but water as well. Would you be able
Yeah,
to throw some light on that, YB?
yeah. Well, I think one is from on one perspective, data is obviously very crucial. I mean, even having a Zoom meeting, that means that we are accessing these
Absolutely.
powers. And obviously, AI is a major reality today. And I think the idea is obviously it's partly driven by the situation in Singapore, where they are discouraging because the impact on not just energy and water, but also the fact that they have very limited land, right? So that has been driving things to Johor. Um, and obviously, I mean, I think for the country to have some, to be able to have house some of these data centers, I think I understand the economic and strategic value of it. But the second part is that when we do that, then and it has happened. I mean, so what are the things that have changed? Because previously, Malaysia has operated on a blanket subsidy model.
Yeah.
So our energy, our water was super cheap. That was how we managed to get industries to come here. And that's a model that many countries use in the beginning, right? But then they start to transition away. So what we have to do, or what we should do, is to use things like what we've done. We've introduced things before like green electricity tariff, GET. Then now we've started with the third party access through CRES, where you can buy renewable energy directly just using the grid to buy to supply
Mhm.
it, to distribute it.
Yeah.
So we should be introducing new premium tariffs for data centers because they are able to pay and they have their own net zero and sustainability target. Similar with water. In fact, we had some regulations that you cannot use wastewater initially, like for some areas, because this is an environmental regulation that we had in the
Yeah.
past. But so I had data centers coming to me saying that they really want to tap into it so that they don't have to use treated water. And it's important for their reporting and all that. So now some of those things have changed, right, to allow that. So I see that value because they are able to pay and they have they have, net zero targets and all that. But having said that, I do think that we have to be very careful because sometimes you do see that this whole data center play becomes a real estate game. So it's actually a lot of landowners trying to drive up the prices, trying to get these data centers to use their land, and so we cannot. And I think I spoke to Tengku Zafrul on this, and he agrees. Where we need to take a more what do you call that, discriminatory approach when we accept data centers. You should not just accept any data centers, right? But I think there are other things that we need to work on as well, right? For example, if you go to Google, you go to various apps today, maybe even LinkedIn and all that, it's default to use AI.
Yeah.
It's always because a way to attract customers, right? But if we can find ways, and I know there's been discussions at the EU and whatnot, where we can, obviously it needs to be a global effort, where these things are, you have to you have to opt in
Opt
rather
in.
than
Yeah.
opt out, right? I
Opt
mean,
in.
these are nudges that you design because just by doing that, then that will mean that a lot of people will not be using AI because a lot of it is unnecessary and frivolous.
Yeah.
I'm not saying AI is all bad. I mean, it's a reality today, but this use for search and all that is something that I don't think is entirely necessary. So, so I think these are things that we also have to have the conversations and it has to be at global level. I mean, we talk to Google, we talk to Microsoft, they're not going to listen to Malaysia. But if we speak as a bloc, maybe at the ASEAN level and all these things, so that we need to AI is not costless. It has a huge cost on the environment, on resources. So the way we design things should be, should trying to regulate the use of AI and not use it, just taking it lock, stock, and barrel. So I think that those are things that we have to have the discussions. But part of it, I also think that the way we look at data centers, we need to be very careful. And your last question was on nuclear. So, when I was in charge of energy or electricity, we have this power development plan under JPAC where we coordinate, we will design in 20 years how much gas plants, solar, and all that we need, based on our requirements. So when 2023 or 20, yeah, I checked the 2023 meeting, we designed the projection until 2042, right? So you have all those similar graphs. And then, but I just said, I'm interested to know how it will look like in 2050 since all this talk of net zero. So then they had a small bar in the graph, and then they said, and then I asked them what's that because that was something that only comes in after 2040. So then they said, well, that's nuclear, right? But they were very, I mean, these were the officers, but they were very nervous about it from the Energy Commission. So I said, but I said, and I, to be honest, it was only by joining the ministry that I became a bit more open to consider nuclear. And I think a lot of even environmentalists in Europe and all that
Yeah.
used to be knee jerk, they will be anti-nuclear. They have started to reassess. Not saying that I'm embracing it in total, but I think we have to consider it, and that's the government's position today. There are studies that are being done because solar has its limitations. We do not have wind. I mean, I saw the graph just now, and there was wind. So I was quite curious about because currently, under current tech, wind is not viable in Malaysia. But so when you look at all that, you add things up, and you need base load, right? Solar is not base
Yeah.
load. So in order to get that steady supply of electricity, which previously was only from coal, from gas, nuclear is one of the solutions. But it has to be done very carefully, and obviously, the government has to make the case for it to the public, because there's a lot of people who are very nervous about nuclear. But I think we have to be pragmatic at it about this matter. If you are talking about carbon emissions, about net zero, then nuclear has to be part of the solution. And that's why one of the reasons, why France and all that, they're doing so well, even the UK, is because of the presence of nuclear. And countries like Germany that stopped nuclear, now they are struggling after Ukraine, with regards to energy. So I think that is something that we cannot discount, to have nuclear in our energy generation.
I completely agree, YB. I think UK is also following in that sense. They're also redeveloping their program. We could talk for hours, YB. Really do appreciate you making the time to be on this webinar with us. We really appreciate your insights. And you're the first one, of course, in the whole lineup of 11 speakers today to give sort of domestic viewpoint to these things. Just before I let you go, one last thing, perhaps, and it may or may not be fair to lob this question your way, but given the fact that we've got sort of a landmark milestone kind of COP coming up this year in Belém, given what's been happening in the lead up to this COP, do you? I know that you're not directly involved, maybe because you're not the minister, but what do you see, or do you envision moving forward that would be pertinent for Malaysia to take as a country to take to the COP? What's the message that Malaysia should be giving to the world?
Well, with all due respect to Azerbaijan, I think this year it's opportunity, to get that momentum, because and I think Brazil being a G20 country, it's the biggest country in South America, but also it has been very vocal on issues regarding the developing world, and also on the issue of climate justice is also heavily targeted by Donald Trump.
Yeah.
I've been actually, after I left the government, I've been doing some work with the Brazilian team on COP. So I was involved in the global ethical stocktake discussions. I couldn't go there physically, but I was involved on it virtually. So I think that, so one of the ways, so the Brazil COP, I think there'll be a lot of talk about climate justice. I think one of the things that, and this was evident even in COP29, where a lot of developing countries, in their frustration with regards to loss and damage, they point out that when it comes to climate, then there's no money, but when it comes to warfare, suddenly there's no problem for people, for the rich countries to look for resources. So Brazil will be good at voicing that out, but also about how to leverage tropical forests. So they have that tropical forest fund initiative. I mean, still a lot of details that I think are not so clear, but we are waiting for it. But the idea is to go beyond this idea of carbon credits, about additionality, degraded forests, because that is actually an advantage to the developed world, because they don't have the resources that we have. So the idea for Brazil, I think, is about how do you value these ecological services that we give to the world by keeping our forests intact. So currently, there is no real valuation to that. So I think what they're trying to do is to have a mechanism where countries that have preserved forests are able to get something out of it. So I think, because that is something for Malaysia as well. One, we are developing. One, we have this forest. We should use COP30 as a way to ensure that this climate diplomacy, you can get a strong influence by countries from similar backgrounds like us. So this is the time. Next year will be, I'm not sure, has it been decided, either Turkey or Australia. But this year, I think, is very key for Malaysia. And knowing Brazil with its leadership, not just President Lula, but also Minister Marina, these are all very strong voices that we should leverage on in order to get the momentum. Obviously, the reality is, US is out of it. But the US, they were never part of the Kyoto Protocol. The Paris Agreement is the second time that they've left.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate, but the world has to move on. And I think countries, I mean, like the EU, I mentioned this in my talks as well before. I think they have to be more pragmatic. I mean, looking at what China, for example, has done right, then and for a country like Malaysia, we need to have all options. So rather than penalize, people who adopt Chinese technology and all that, I think we need to look at what's the best way for us to fight climate change, and we have to be agnostic about the technology. But there's so much, other stuff that is going into that. So my hope, because without the US, we need the EU, we need China, we need India, we need all these other countries, the major economies, to work together so that we still have a chance with regards to fighting climate change.
Thanks so very, very much, YB Nik Nazmi, for taking the time to be with us and to be part of our Global Summit 2025. Really do appreciate your time and your views. It's always a pleasure having you, and we hope to have you again should we have this next year. So thanks. All of you for your questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them, but we'll try to get written replies wherever possible. Do keep them coming. Pass it back to Jia Tian for the next session. Thank you very much, YB.
Thank you.